Hello, and welcome to the second lecture in the Who Do You Think You Are module for the class and community case study, looking at the social and economic history of the community known as Scousers. This week, we're going to build on what we were talking about in the first lecture, where Liverpool is really at the height of its economic power and influence at the turn of the 20th century. And we can see how important Liverpool continues to be at the beginning of the 20th century through the continued immigration into the city, as well as the diversification of the groups we find moving to Liverpool because of the opportunities available. And it was still very much seen as a place to move to if you wanted to find employment and aspired for social mobility. In the early 20th century, we see a couple of interesting new groups moving into Liverpool. Firstly, the Italian community reaches Liverpool by certainly 1910, and the phrase Little Italy is used in a number of guides on the area. Traditionally, the Italians moved to the poorer areas of Liverpool along canal systems, which is one of the reasons why it began to be known as Little Italy, as a reference to the Venetian canals. But you also get large numbers of Chinese people settling in Liverpool as well. And that is because of the Alfred Holt Company and the Blue Funnel Line. Now, I spoke in the first lecture a lot about the importance of Liverpool within the Atlantic markets and the links to North and South America. However, by this time, transportation methods have improved, and Liverpool begin to increasingly trade with the lucrative Southeast Asian and Chinese markets. And this brings a new level of wealth into the city as Chinese merchants bring silk and valuable spices to the region. And lots of Chinese people decide to stay because of the cheap housing available to them. And this creates new dynamics and ideas around what is a Scouser? Do you have to be born into Liverpool to be a Scouser? A lot of the migrant groups over the next few decades, their accents change and sound like Scousers as well. So the idea of what it is to be a Scouser can change as well. Also, Irish immigration continues to be very high in the early 20th century. And these new migrant communities, whether it's the Irish, Chinese, or Italians, bring new trades to the town, and this only increases the wealth. However, that is not to say that there are not emerging new problems in Liverpool. A lot of these migrant communities are moving to small and poor areas. The Italians along the canals, and the Chinese actually around the docks themselves. And with the Chinese market, especially, a black market around opium emerges. So drugs are suddenly brought to Liverpool. Um, and also, just whenever there is migration, there is tensions with the locals in the area about jobs and resources. And of course, earlier 20th century Britain, there is a lot of xenophobia anyway. So there are a number of problems emerging, including sectarian religious divisions, Catholic Italians and Irish clashing with Protestants in Liverpool. Um, there are a number of Irish marches which cause tension within the community. Orange marches, which celebrate the defeat of King James in the 16th century, causes a lot of tension within the community. And actually, Liverpool Football Club is associated with Protestant groups, whilst Everton becomes associated with Catholic groups. So even on sporting dates, you get increased tension there. But despite some of these problems that emerge in poorer migrant communities on the fringes of the town or around the docks, Liverpool continues to be incredibly wealthy and successful in this time period. And this is visible through the transformation of the city through its architecture. And you really are able to see the influence of the middle class merchants and bankers in this time period. Extravagant banking buildings are created. Georgian and Victorian styles become incredibly popular. And you see along the waterfront and in the city centre these enormously extravagant buildings that really celebrate the success of Liverpool. The most famous one being the middle image on this slide in 1911 with the creation of the Liver building. And a lot of these buildings become tourist attractions for people from outside of Britain. And you have internationally renowned exhibitions and museums and libraries in Liverpool. So it really becomes a centre of culture as well. But this physical transformation really tells you everything you need to know about how successful Liverpool had been in the 18th and 19th century. And the religious impact is evident as well with the building of Liverpool Cathedral, which is still to this day what the fifth largest cathedral in the world. And if you have a chance to go, I'd suggest, really recommend it because it is physically imposing on the inside and beautiful from the outside and beautiful on the inside as well. So the buildings of Liverpool really give us an insight into how successful the town has been. However, all this progress that we spoke about in the first lecture and the start of this lecture begins to fall apart with the advent of the First World War. And what we see at the start of the First World War, some of you might have heard of it. The figure on the right of your screen, who with the big moustache pointing and saying, "Your country wants you," that is Lord Kitchener. And Lord Kitchener develops one of the most effective recruitment drives and propaganda campaigns the world has ever seen at the beginning of the First World War. He plays on Victorian ideals of masculinity to get men to sign up to join the Imperial War. And I've included some of the propaganda uh, posters that people in Liverpool might have seen. The famous one on the left is "The army is not all work." It is portrayed to the people of Britain that it's going to be a bit of an adventure that you and your friends can go on together. And the middle picture is a child asking their father, "Daddy, what did you do in the Great War?" Playing on masculinity, saying that your family won't respect you if you don't go. And this is incredibly impactful throughout Britain, but especially in Liverpool in particular. Kitchener's recruitment drive was enormously successful in Liverpool. And there are a number of reasons this could have been. The most compelling is that the city was built on empire. I spoke in the first lecture about how enthusiastic people were in Liverpool about colonialism. And the Liverpool Pals division is surprisingly big. Extra room and barracks have to be built because 3,000 men of Liverpool volunteer within the first 5 days of the war. You have these prolonged and extensive recruitment drives in the businesses of the ports and the economic heart of the city as well. So it shows how much support there was for the British Empire in Liverpool. And that's because the entire success of the city was built on colonial trade. However, this is disastrous for Liverpool. 2,800 of the initial 3,000 men who volunteer die before the end of the war. 200 in one day at the sum. For whether it was random or by choice, the Liverpool battalions end up in some of the most fierce fighting in the war, and the numbers of men are devastated as a result. But it's not just the workforce of Liverpool that is decimated in the First World War. The entire infrastructure of the Liverpool's economy is isolated from the wider Atlantic experience. What you get in the First World War is a German U boat campaign. So the Germans spend enormous amounts of money cutting Britain off from their imperial territories so they cannot trade anymore. And on a city built on trade, this is devastating. So Liverpool's workforce is decimated through the volunteers, and their access to trade with the markets that helped create the town is greatly restricted as well. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the First World War. I'll talk more about it in the seminar. But after it ends, Liverpool is affected much more than many other urban centres throughout Britain because of its lack of ability to trade with its partners. After the war ends, other countries around the world aren't demanding northern products anymore. There is less demand for British made products because countries are too busy rebuilding the infrastructure of their countries. And global trade is halved in this time period. And of course, this has a massive effect on Liverpool as a city. Um, to rebuild Britain and re-stimulate the economy, taxes rise sharply, which, as many people in Liverpool had lost their jobs, severely affected the population of Liverpool. And there is a disproportionately high level of people in Liverpool who are unemployed as a result of the First World War compared to other towns. And this is really the beginning of the negative stereotype that Liverpool people from Liverpool and Scousers are perennially unemployed. Even at football games now, this is one of the biggest insults Liverpool fans get, and they're often referred to as bin dippers because they are taking from the state, which seems horribly unfair considering that the only reason the jobs in Liverpool were gone was because of the war. And what you get generally amongst the country is the northern towns in England are left behind as the politicians in London focus on rebuilding London and cities in the south. And this really cements the north south divide. This is the beginning of northern towns um, feeling as though they've been left behind by the political elite of the country. And this is really strongly felt by Liverpool, who had traditionally voted for Tory MPs, but throughout the 20th century increasingly moved towards socialist policies and socialist politicians. And this is where trade unions in Liverpool really begin to be formed to organise the workforce and demand better wages. But also, a lot of the men who did return with physical disabilities and shell shock, what we now know as post traumatic stress. So the workforce is divided and down on its luck. To try and combat some of these problems, there is a national housing building mission created, and the program builds around 11 million houses by 1939, or 8 million as early as 1921. Now, there are a lot of houses built in Liverpool, but disproportionately less compared to other cities. But a lot of the housing you will see in Liverpool now was built in this time period. 30,000 council houses built in Liverpool. And I've included some examples on this slide. And what you can see on the bottom right slide is the area of Anfield. The stadium is called Anfield, but is also in an area of Liverpool known as Anfield. And these terraced houses, which were cheap to build and could include lots of people inside of them, is really popular and dominates the landscape of inner city Liverpool. And a lot of the people who were forced to move into these houses because they lost unemployment were on unemployment benefits, which began in 1920 to try and support the struggling um, economics of the country and ailing industries. It is in this time period of economic and social crises in Liverpool The popular culture in Britain changes drastically as well. Now, this isn't specific to Liverpool, this is a wider British issue. But as people returned from the war, many people lost their religious passions. They didn't go to church as much. You can see in Liverpool and throughout the country, church attendances drastically decrease. And what you get replacing it is the development of a pub culture, people drinking. Without the religious constraints, people become more sexually liberated and they place money on gambling and the races. And football becomes huge, especially in Liverpool. If you remember from the last lecture, the two stadiums are within a mile of each other, and tendencies at Liverpool and Everton become huge in this time period, especially as Everton become quite a successful team, winning the old First Division and the FA Cup in the 20s. So you can see people moving away from religious doctrine and towards more leisurely pursuits. And Liverpool, at the heart of the Liverpool community, is sport and football. However, this is only a temporary thing as eventually the Second World War breaks out and all sport is called off. And in the Second World War, Liverpool is again decimated by the conflict. I said in the first lecture about how important Liverpool's position in the Atlantic world was. Well, in the Second World War, the longest and most sustained military campaign was the battle for the Atlantic. A complicated war front opens up between the Axis powers and the Allied nations to take control of the trade routes of the Atlantic. And despite all the trade problems Liverpool had experienced since the First World War, 90% of imports still come to Britain through Liverpool. This is why it is targeted by Hitler and Germany, because they want to try and disrupt British trade. And Liverpool is the most heavily impacted by the Blitz outside of London. So it sees prolonged periods of aerial bombardment, and they are specifically targeting the Liverpool ports, docks to try and disrupt trade. What is interesting about this is that the British government downplays the problem. Churchill, in particular, doesn't want there to be panic in Britain about access to food or access to munitions. He also doesn't want the Germans. He doesn't want the Germans to realise that they're having an impact on British trade, even though they are. So Churchill and the British government downplay the problems experienced by Liverpool. And nationally, there is very little coverage of the extensive damage that Liverpool receives. And after the war has concluded, this narrative that Liverpool was not that badly affected continues to be perpetuated, which obviously, if you had experienced the Liverpool Blitz, would make you extremely angry. And again, we see how this begins to lead to anti conservatism. So let's explore the actual damage, not the propaganda forward by the British government, but what really happened during the Liverpool Blitz. In May 1941 alone, 2,315 high explosive bombs are dropped on the city. The city's infrastructure, the houses that had been built, are decimated. 4,000 people are killed. So these aren't soldiers, these are people who remained in Liverpool, often women who working in munition factories. So people who had not experienced the terrors of war in the First World War are seeing it within their home now. And one of the most important things that happens is the destruction of the SS Malakand, which was carrying 1,000 tons of bombs and at port at Huskisson dock, which is on the River Mersey. When the Malakand is hit by bombs, obviously the 1,000 tons of explosives on it decimate the port, destroying a large area of the Merseyside port. There are reports that parts of the Malakand are found 1 mile away from it. So that goes to show how explosive the incident was. In addition to those, 6,500 homes are destroyed. 190,000 are damaged to the point of nearly being written off. 70,000 people are left homeless as a result of the Liverpool Blitz. Railway lines, which were some of the first tram systems in the world, were destroyed. Gas, electric, and telephone services are pretty much decimated. I've included on this slide St. Luke's, which was an important place of worship in Liverpool, that was gutted as a result of the Blitz. And it stands today as a testament to the damage done, is often used for food and catering events. But Liverpool's infrastructure is destroyed. And that is on top of the job market that was destroyed as a result of the First World War. So you can see how, in the space of 20 or 30 years, all the progress, all the economic and industrial expansion that had taken place in the 18th and 19th century is completely undone in a very short amount of time, and it devastates the city and and continues to have lasting effects today. So my main concluding points are on this slide for you to make a note of, and I want to quickly go over what we'll be talking about in the seminar. So I asked you to read something about the first lecture, and I'm going to ask you to watch something about this one. So watch the BBC documentary on the Liverpool Blitz, which is called May Blitz, The 7 Days That Rocked Liverpool. It's on YouTube, and I'll put the link on Moodle as well. I'm going to put a lot of different links on Moodle for you to have a look at and do some background reading of if you so want. I want you to think about the following questions that I'll cover in the seminar. One, how might the world wars have affected Scousers and their relationship with the rest of Britain? Because this is when we first see negative relations between Liverpool and other communities. Two, think about, why was Liverpool so badly affected by the world wars compared to other parts of the country? So everywhere in Britain suffered in the world wars. Why Liverpool so badly? Thirdly, what was the role of religion in the city, and how did this change? And then finally, how did the role of football change? I haven't really gone into much detail about football in this lecture, and it's certainly the lecture with the least about football. But how did the community football and community change in this time period? So think about those questions, watch the documentary, and we'll discuss them all in the seminar. Thank you.